Josh was asked to come and talk about sort of the current state of security as he's worked on the VVSG requirements as well as other work that Josh does. And in particular, both Mary and Josh, and so I'll give you a chance to introduce Josh's remarks, attended Defcon recently and spoke to some of the folks there and had a similar conversation with them. And so we wanted to offer the TGDC that opportunity to hear that same conversation. So I'll turn it over to Mary to kind of introduce.
And I do think that Josh has maybe some of the slides that were left over from DEFCON, but I think what we're trying to do here is to provide you some information on the changing threat model in voting systems over the years, and leave you with some ideas about how we might be able to move forward.
Josh, it's all yours.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so this is definitely part of the conversation that we had at DEFCON. That slide deck had a lot of intro material that really wouldn't work here, and so I added some additional thoughts and opinions. So basically, we're going to talk about overall election infrastructure security, voting systems security, some priorities that I see in this area, and some possible ways forward. I really enjoy this slide. It highlights some practical election security issues from 1934. This was work done by Joseph Harris when he was studying election administration issues back then. And what you'll see is that we are still concerned about many of these issues. In fact, we have, with the advent of electronic voting systems, sort of made modern electronic analogs to many of these without necessarily solving some of the older ones. And it's sort of just interesting to look at the types of things that they were really worried about back then. But today we have a much larger and more diverse election system. We have local and online voter registration systems. Some states even have counties with dedicated terminals to interact with the voter registration system. We have electronic and paper poll books, candidate filing systems, and that's just some of the back-end election infrastructure. Campaigns themselves also have some pretty complex tech, especially campaign voter information databases. On the right side of this slide, you see things that are more vote capture and tabulation systems, things that this body is more generally concerned about.
Hey, so I'm just curious, Josh, did you draw that? Where did that come from?
You did.
I ain't gonna say nothing, man.
He drew it.
That is pretty impressive. I like that.
You guys are welcome to steal it.
If I were you, just drop the mic and go.
That's right. You're done.
Let's do this. Everyone can buy me lunch. No, it's yeah. I mean, you guys are welcome to take it. It's definitely a rehashing of Merle King's sort of famous slide. He had a lot more information in there that I sort of add.
But he's not an artist, so that's the difference.
Yeah. So we have to start thinking about what practical attacks are we having on these systems. There was lots of press on election attacks that we saw in the 2016 election. What are we actually seeing nowadays? We have seen attacks on voter registration systems, data exfiltration from voter registration systems. We've seen phishing attempts of both election officials and voting system vendors. We've seen doxing of political campaigns where private campaign information is made public, and then attacks on back-end non-tabulation systems. And I do think that we need to take a step back and say, are we doing what we need to, protect the overall election infrastructure of the U.S. And what this, Office of the Director of National Intelligence report is actually saying here is that they think that these attackers will be back. So we need to start planning now about how to make our overall systems more secure. And I think we've been all taking steps toward that. So nowadays, I do think we have an expanding threat model. Traditionally, I think folks who are really worried about physically proximate attackers, folks who had physical access for a long period to voting systems. Accidental events and natural disasters were generally the most common issues leading to incorrect election outcomes. We haven't necessarily seen a lot of attacks on vote capture and tabulation systems. And just general events affecting public confidence and trust in the overall voting system. But lately what we've seen is that we've had nation state threats, phishing of work and personal accounts, attacks on supporting election infrastructure. So I think what we need to think about nowadays for our more modern threat model is all these traditional attacks and then all these new recent attacks as well, and it definitely makes our jobs a lot harder. So what does a modern voting system look like? The actual systems that are deployed in most states right now. Most of them are running some sort of legacy Linux OS. They typically are using an older or proprietary physical media. Many of them, or most of them, have a working TCP/IP stack. Wireless and public telecom is fairly common in some areas. These systems are basically mandated to last for 10 to 15 years, and software updates come to these voting systems sometimes. But this is slowly changing. I hope I'm not making McDermott a little bit unhappy over there. Right? Folks who have actually taken a real serious look at these systems have noticed some issues. NIST has done some internal research that will get published at some point in the near future, basically looking at all the academic and other literature available for when people actually got their hands on voting systems and actually got to look at the source code and how these systems work. And what they saw is that it was fairly often to have large cryptographic flaws, large issues with authentication, large issues with input validation, and these are pretty common security categories of issues that many industries are having to deal with. But what's been changing since the 2007 recommendations to the EAC? There's been a lot of changes in both industry and voting system tech. In terms of security capabilities that are in industry, we have newer things like secure boot, strong process isolation. Many of the phones that you all have in your pockets have some really nice security capabilities that we'd love to have on modern voting systems. Exploit mitigation technologies, new and fancy network protocols. We have larger, more practical cybersecurity frameworks, things that can help out with the actual operations and administration of large IT systems. In terms of innovations in voting systems security, we have the concept of software independence, risk limiting audits, EDE verifiable cryptographic protocols, and just generally recognition of usability as a security issue. It would be absolutely wonderful to, incorporate both of these, industry practices and, newer things into some of the security conversation that we're having. And I think that we definitely are, of course, with, software independence in some of these other areas. But paper itself is not a panacea. Paper ballots provide tamper detection and enable auditability, but paper can be modified, swapped, as we saw thinking back to that first 1934 slide. Yeah, lost, stolen, definitely. Seals and chain of custody actually need to be verified, or maybe it's not, maybe they're not serving their, intended purpose. Same thing with software independence, or, just any system that's actually using paper ballots. If we're not, checking the election outcome, that's potentially a big problem. I think we all recognize that administrative controls are extremely important and have a huge impact on the election process. And just, cyber hygiene issues as well exist. And all these things are, problems even if you have a, paper-based or, software independent voting system. And so that sort of leads me to this, to this next concept. What can we lean on? What's out there? What do we have standards and best practices for? Standards and best practices are definitely, different concepts. Something like a standard might be HTTPS. What that actually means to a developer that's going to, make up a cryptographic library for that standard. But best practice would be to actually use HTTPS, for instance. The VVSG is a voluntary voting system standard, and it's sort of the only game in town sort of here that we have, and we have tons of best practices available from multiple different areas, including EAC, DHS, NIST, EVN's top 10. These are all excellent resources. But I think that we might need some, additional work in these areas. In terms of voluntary security standards, again, we, essentially have DREs, OpScans, ballot marking devices back in election management systems. We are, lacking voluntary security standards with, many of these systems. And maybe that's okay. This is just something to, point out, food for thought. In terms of best practices, we are starting to get some great work in the voter registration realm, especially with DHS and EAC helping out. Same thing with election night reporting. NIST has done some work with some UACAVA systems, and then of course DREs, OpScans, and ballot marking devices. We do have some work in that area, but there are best practices missing for some election IT supporting systems that I think we can maybe take a look at. In fact, many of these areas that we do have best practices for, maybe we need a more full treatment of that topic. These are definitely complex information systems that have a large impact on our nation. So these are sort of my, big important election security issues. We need both accessible and auditable systems. We need external scrutiny of voting systems. It's a nice check against the, EAC, NIST, voting system test lab certification process. Generally, when third parties get their, hands on these systems, we learn something new. And so I think, external scrutiny of these systems is actually fairly critical. Software updates for voting system. Mr. Kelly brought this up yesterday. Making sure that we don't have voting systems with, 10-year-old critical bugs is pretty important. And I know that the EAC is, working to address that issue. And just, generally the security posture of some of these supporting infrastructure systems is just unknown. A lot of people haven't, been able to take a look at them. That's on the technology side. On the election management side, we need meaningful post-election audits, and start incorporating new cyber hygiene procedures into the election management process. And I'm not saying that no one does that. It's just an important aspect that I think we need to focus on. You generally can't just put up problems without solutions. I'm pretty sure Matt would yell at me, and then Mary would have her say too. So solving these issues, I think these are some pretty reasonable steps. Threat modeling and risk assessments for all parts of the election process and for all of the systems involved. I definitely think it's worthwhile taking a look at the systems that were actively attacked in the 2016 general. I think we need best practices for procedural election security. When I go and visit counties and jurisdictions, people are definitely doing things differently, but it's sometimes hard to understand if something actually has a tangible security benefit or if it's just sort of something that people have been doing for a long time. I think it might be worthwhile for someone to go in, do that research, see what's necessary, see if we can trim some fat and make the physical security process itself a little bit cheaper, meaner. Same thing with post-election audits. There's tons of different types of post-election audits, and everyone's implementing them differently. I think it might be worthwhile to take a look at some of these and figure out some best practices and procedures for doing that. And my thought on many of these is that this best practices and guidance are going to be coming from many of the folks here who are actually doing some many of these things. I do think that we need to be looking at usable security controls for voting systems, making sure that we're increasing security without affecting access, without making these systems harder to use. Secure patching, that might be something that could be implemented inside of the EAC's certification process, or maybe it's something that we put into the VVSG. Maybe it's something that's that just the community comes together on to make this happen. And I think we need better information sharing between all levels of government, local, state, federal, industries, just the general security community. Another big solution, I think, is just more enhanced cybersecurity awareness. All industries, I would say, are generally dealing with this. We could be talking about a big hack that affected some big U.S. companies last week, but then you might not think that I'm talking about the same company because it's hitting every other. It's just hitting so many different sectors at the same time. Elections is no different. We need to have increased cybersecurity awareness. We need to do we need to help folks understand, especially election officials, how modern computers are really attacked. How things like an air gap is extremely valuable, but it does not stop everything. DHS has been doing some awesome work in this area with online educational materials. So has the EAC. But I think election officials need cybersecurity information and best practices in a language that they understand. I don't think we should just be handing large technical documents to election officials without putting that information in the context of elections, which is going to be hard, right? It's going to be a difficult thing. It's going to take time, unfortunately. But when we start doing that, I think things like incident response would be a great starting point. Physical and operational security, decommissioning older systems and sanitizing media before these older voting systems are given away. Authentication issues, password and cryptographic key management, I think would be all excellent topic areas. So who's going to actually do this work, right? NIST, DHS, CAC can't do this alone. Local election officials can't be expected to defend themselves against nation-state attackers. But many of these issues are, broader than just the tech that we're sitting here talking about. We have, policy, law, procedures, people. This is a very complicated space. And it's going to take a lot of work, but I think it's going to basically take government, industry, academia, the greater, broader elections community. But I think this is a conversation worth having. And I know it's outside of our scope a little bit, but I just wanted to bring some thoughts up. Any questions? We have tons of references if anyone's interested.
Yeah, no one's interested. No. Questions or comments for Josh? Neil?
Josh, thank you, by the way, for this. You, a couple slides ago, had mentioned the desire to have external scrutiny on voting systems. And I'm not asking you to solve the world's problems today. I'm just curious, how do you envision, what does that look like?
That's a great question, and that's a really hard issue. I think I think that the Defcon voting hacking village was fairly successful in that area with having a realistic and meaningful conversation about what the current systems look like, what they can what can be done to actually secure them. I think that might be one avenue. I could definitely see having some universities provided regular access to these systems. Maybe this is something that, if there was, for instance, like an open source voting system, that would be something, that would, encourage open scrutiny there. But that is a difficult challenge there that I think is going to take a long time before we start getting there.
Other questions or comments for Josh?
Technically, we do have external scrutiny on the voting systems. It's the EAC.
The EAC's process is critical there. It's just sometimes when folks who think a little bit differently, get their hands on voting systems, they tend to be coming at the security model sideways, in ways that were not really intended from the outset, and we always tend to learn something new there. And so I think a little more external, might I say.
Understood.
Bob?
I just want to thank you, Josh, and Mary, and NIST, and EAC, and I know we have DHS coming up, and it's been a crazy year for election officials in this realm, and you guys have really done a great job keeping us informed. And I think we're probably going to talk about it in the next session, but we're really on the cusp of kind of taking that next step, so we're pretty excited about that. But I wanted to recognize the work you guys have done at NIST and EAC and DHS.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Diane?
And I just wanted to acknowledge, I'm so happy to see a security session that actually doesn't ignore accessibility and acknowledges that we are not going to go down this same. I know, Josh. I know
It's
you were
first.
in there. And I know.
Don't spike the
You
football,
don't
Josh.
want the
Just take
wrath
the
of,
compliment.
anyway. So I'm complimenting you. And what's so interesting is many of your side-by-sides, we have standards for this. We don't for e-poll books. We don't have accessibility standards for e-poll books. We don't have, every place you said we don't have security specification, we don't have accessibility specificities requirements either. So we're in this ship together, guys. Everything that we're trying to balance it over here on the standards, we've got the same issues. And trust me, the disability community would love access to voting systems, to do external reviews on them. It's the same exact issue. You can't get your hands on them. You can't buy them unless you're an election official. So you can't train people how to use the electronic interface because nobody will sell one to you. They won't even sell you one that doesn't tabulate votes. We have the same issue about that external access too. They are not publicly available and transparent, and it's a big issue, a really big issue. So I'll make that plug. It's not just a security issue. It's an accessibility issue also.
Yes, ma'am. I didn't think about that. It makes complete sense. Yeah.
McDermott?
There's also a big training issue here because for all the best laid plans of the vendors and trying to put security in place, much like a driver going down the streets of New Jersey, if they choose not to use the turn signals, there's nothing we can do about it.
That's a fair point. That's a good point.
Yeah, right. Linda Lamone.
In reaction to what you just said, Diane, it's my understanding that at least recently, for the last 6-7 years, a lot of the vendors have been giving their voting systems to like the National Federation of the Blind for training and outreach. No, they're not doing that anymore?
As far as I know, NFB has that national contract that's under HAVA 261 or something, anyway, section. But the equipment they got was original equipment, kind of, and I don't think they've ever gotten anything current or new. And we've just tried it locally, again, doing, when we had the EAC grant, and we were doing structured demonstrations to see how long it took people to get comfortable using access features. And I mean, we had to beg, we had to, in one state where we did the demonstrations, we had to pay to rent the equipment directly from the manufacturer because we couldn't get it any other way. And you can't just buy it if you're not an election official.
Well,
So, anyway.
so the experience was similar. I mean, it is kind of crazy to both your point. I mean, that Defcon's experience is the same, where they bought it off eBay, but it was mostly almost, and you tell me if I'm wrong, original equipment, equipment purchased with original HAVA funds, not any of the newer pieces of equipment. So it's a similar conversation, and several of the systems Defcon had already been decertified in a number of states. I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, Matt, I was just going to point out that I know that the Ohio Secretary of State works, I know, with the American Council of the Blind of Ohio, with all of their voting equipment.
Yeah, I think several states do some of that, but I think the challenge that Diane has routinely pointed out to me over the years, which isn't wrong, is that the best time to get in with the manufacturers and do this is while they're designing and building, right? Once the state gets a hold of it, there's less that the state can do either to improve the security or accessibility of the system. The question I have for you is kind of a general one. It may even pull you into one of your other areas, and that is, after this year and some of the activities and conversations and whatnot, there's a hesitance amongst some in the elections community to engage the security community because there's a sense of fear of embarrassment or a desire to not engage in a collaborative fashion, fair or unfair. What suggestions do you have, if any, to improve that engagement, to have a more collaborative engagement where there's a recognition by the election officials these folks have something of value to bring in this conversation, and there's a recognition from the security folks that election officials haven't been ignoring security. In fact, given the limited resources they have, they've been really engaged on this. They may not know what to do, or as you said, may not come from it at the same angle, but they want to. I don't know an election official that doesn't want to improve the security. It may just be an understanding. So what suggestions do you have on a collaborative working together front and tangible steps perhaps that could be done either by us or election officials to do that?
Yeah, I mean, so I've definitely seen many security researchers come into this area and thinking that they know everything there is to know about security, and then find that they're left wanting a bit because elections is a very deep field, and so I think that as folks learn more about elections, they start having a more responsible conversation with their election official, and so to that end, I definitely say that any security researcher wanting to get into this area, needs to talk with their local election official. Elections are a hyper-local activity, and so getting involved in that process and actually learning how elections are run is how we start having a good conversation there. I think another issue there is responsible vulnerability disclosure. You can't just 10 days before an election tell everyone that there's a critical vulnerability in some election system, without offering time to fix it. People don't need to be dropping zero 0 days on election day. I would say that we sort of saw some, cyber security firms in, 2016 trying to do things like that. And I think that really hurts this, conversation. And at least, I've been working in this area since 2004. When I first came in, I saw a lot of animosity on both sides, between the, technical community, I would say, and then between election officials. But as I've been here for, the past, 10 plus years, gosh, I'm getting old, is that these, communities have, learned to work together, and at least they're, really starting to have meaningful conversations that are making all of us more secure.
Thank you.